Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Goat Show. Got our attention this week. I'm Josh, and I'm here with Joe as always. And Joe, what's got our attention this week?
Today, what's got our attention is the Spider-Man narrative. And more to the point, I think we'll kind of be deconstructing the Spider-Man narrative and looking at it in the context of the superhero genre at large, and superhero movies in particular. We just saw Spider-Man Homecoming,
yeah. Which we both very much liked.
Yes, and so that kind of got us talking about the different aspects of that movie, and really looking at the other Spider-Man movies which we've seen, which shall not be named.
Some of them, unfortunately, yes.
So we got to talking kind of about what made this one special, and kind of what makes Spider-Man special as a superhero. I've been a fan of Spider-Man for forever.
Since you're a wee little boy.
Yeah, and admittedly, I think a few little caveats up front. One is we're really going to kind of lean mostly on the movie universe, right, or movie universes for this discussion. But we will kind of talk about TV and comics a bit. While we've both collected comics in the past, read comics, we're kind of generally familiar. We are not comic book experts. I think that would be fair.
I think we're a level below, I don't know if nerd is right. We're not like the super ones, and I certainly couldn't name you, in Spider-Man episode number whatever, or in comic whatever, but we're very familiar with the narrative in general.
Yeah.
I said you more so than more. You were a bigger Spider-Man fan than I was, but I'm still a Spider-Man fan, and he is, I think, to me, he's one of the truly unique heroes in the whole Heroverse.
Right.
Sometimes there's overlap between superheroes and whether it's DC and Marvel, and they have similarities. He really, I don't think, has an equal, so to speak, and he is his own. Yeah,
his
own entity.
There's a reason that he
still
features
popular.
So prominently, right, in the Marvel universe, and why, when 9/11 happened, Marvel said we got to do something about 9/11,
right,
and it was Spider-Man, because he's their New York guy.
Right.
And which is interesting when you think about it, because the Fantastic Four are way older than Spider-Man.
It's true.
And they're New York. And not only that, but they actually own real estate in downtown New York. He doesn't. But I mean, I think...
that's actually an interesting point. We actually didn't discuss this before we planned this out. He is one of the few superheroes in either universe that is tied to an actual existing city, right? Metropolis, Gotham, are specific, but they're not city, Star City in the DC universe. Marvel universe, Fantastic Four are in a city, but it's not... The Baxter Building is just a building in New York. Mm-hmm. It's not a character. And in Spider-Man's universe, New York, Queens, it's part of Spider-Man.
Right.
And that makes him, I think, much more relatable to people. You can't say, I was in Metropolis, or I saw the statue of Batman, or whatever, or the X-Men mansion that looks like this castle in Massachusetts, right? But it's not real. Yeah. Spider-Man was real. He lived in real places that real people lived and interacted with real people.
Well, that's the whole idea. He's always been the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, right? And they riff on that a bit in Homecoming, and I think I would say in all the movies to a certain extent. Horribly in the first Sam Raimi film, in my opinion, they have a whole they try to include these sequences where New York kind of shouts out Spider-Man's part of New York, right, and us New Yorkers we look out for each other, and right. I don't know why people feel the need to do that. As someone who's not a New Yorker, I don't know why they feel they have to keep telling us that they seem to think that they're so well bonded.
I think because he's part of the character, but I agree in that they don't have to ram it in our face.
Yes.
We get it. He's in New York. Yes, he's swinging through the cities and the cityscape, and New York has lots of skyscrapers, which is perfect for somebody who has to attach web things to. We get it. He has a hot dog. He has a pretzel cart. And we get all those things. I get it. You don't have to keep just ramming it like it's your baby picture in my face. We understand. Yes. I agree.
And they did a very, and I'm going to say it, in this movie they did a very good job in the sequence where
This movie being Homecoming?
Yes.
Right.
I don't really want to get too deep into... I don't want to dance around things at the expense of the conversation. So if you...
Gentle spoiler alert.
Yeah. So
we're going to try our best, but there's a
very good chance
might
there
be a
some
chance.
Spoilers.
So if you haven't seen it yet or care, here's your spoiler alert. And
exactly.
Please don't crap on
Good
us.
News. It's a good movie.
Right.
Go see it. It's worth it. So maybe do that first and then come back to this podcast. It'll keep. So So there's a sequence kind of early on in the film where he's all excited and he's out and he wants to be doing things, and he stops like a bike thief, and he's running around and he's kind of standing on a top of an apartment building, and there's a guy at like a cart or something, and he yells out like, "Hey, you're Spider-Man, like do a backflip." And like there's a definite feeling of him engaging with the community, but there's also a definite feeling that he's different from other superheroes because of that too. There's a sequence where he's discussing with Tony Stark, and Tony's kind of like, he wants to be an Avenger so bad, and Tony's like, don't want to be an Avenger. Just be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And he kind of comes to own that. And I think that's great. That's something that I always felt back when I was collecting comics. They did another one of these Avengers shakeups. I think it was the Avengers Disassemble, Avengers Assemble iteration.
Sounds right.
Yeah. So, but in one of these things, they essentially rebuilt the Avengers, and when they rebuilt the Avengers, they said, okay, well, we got Captain America, and I think they had Captain America, and they put Wolverine in, which makes a lot of sense, because Wolverine's super popular, although he's super popular because he's a loner, so
right.
That doesn't make a lot of sense. Anyways, and then they're like, oh, and we'll put Spider-Man in. Because Tony Stark's going to give him this Iron Spider costume and give him all these extra powers and give him all these extra abilities. And everyone loves Spider-Man, so let's put him in this other comic. And I was like, that's...
You just removed the essence of Spider-Man.
Yeah, you removed a lot of his charm. And his charm is part of his isolation. I mean, the idea... more recently, as they aged him, you kind of get this idea of he's a guy who's trying to find his way as an adult, as young adults ourselves.
We've all been through that.
Yeah. But, I mean, the charm, this kind of goes back to this idea of what Spider-Man Homecoming is targeting, and what really got a lot of people interested in Spider-Man at the outset, was this idea of him as a teenager. He's not a grown person. He's not... I mean, you look at someone like Steve Rogers, who decides he's going to join the military, he's just made an adult decision about the path of his life,
right.
And he kind of signs up for superherohood. I mean, Spider-Man falls into it.
You could actually, sorry, before you even get to that, you could argue before, he always wanted to do that.
Yes.
And he knew he had to wait his turn and kept trying. You know, he really didn't get it until he was at a mature level. Now, of course, other things were involved in that too, but yes, we get Spider-Man as Spider-Man's trying to grow up, but he doesn't want to grow up, right?
Exactly. And the anguish, I mean, the tortured hero is a kind of a common thing throughout a lot of Marvel narratives, and you look at the Hulk, you look at Iron Man, and and throughout superheroes. It's part of the kind of this hero narrative, and something that's
almost more the human narrative to it, right?
That
they all have, underneath it all, they're still, whether they are human beings, whatever, they're still people as we relate them to, and everybody's got their problems, regardless if you can save the world or not. Yeah. But as a kid, what's your maturity level to deal with that stuff?
Exactly.
You're going through all the other stuff that you deal with when you're 15, 16, 17, and we know how much fun that can be, both literally and not so much. And on top of that, you've got the weight of being a hero.
Right, exactly.
And again, I think that relates back to how relatable Spider-Man is, right? That's one of the things that I think Homecoming did very well. All three incarnations now of Spider-Man movies, whether it's Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, or Tom Holland, they've all tried to address the fact that he's a teenager and he's got teenage problems, whether he's in university in one of them, or this one, or the high school were the last two, because it wasn't Tobey Maguire, weren't they in high school? Weren't they in university, sorry?
No, it was high school in the first
right.
one.
Sorry. Yeah, that's right, he graduated, that's right. Anyways, regardless, they put them all in high school, and they're teenagers and they have teenage problems, whether it's girls or whatever. But this one does a much better job of showing us the immaturity of a teenager.
Right.
And there's scenes in this movie wherein he's basically a whining kid who, has that argument with his parents, so to speak. In this case, the authoritative figure being Tony Stark of, I want to do X. Stop treating me like a kid.
Right.
And this response is, you are a kid. You don't get it. You've got to earn it. Trust me, I know what I'm doing.
Right.
As Tony's biggest fear, as is sort of they go through the movie, is that he's going to make a mistake. And he's going to end up losing not just a hero, but a child, or he's going to make a mistake and kill other people, etc. That he's still an untapped talent.
Right.
That he needs to learn how to focus and et cetera, et cetera. And that's his salvation throughout this movie. That it does end, of course, and ends up happening.
Right.
But that was not done in the other two movies. Yeah, we get it. Okay, he's a teenager and he's, in the girls and whatever, in school. He's got to balance that stuff. And that's it. He's already seemingly... His biggest problem is wanting to protect Aunt May or Mary Jane or I forget who did when...
Gwen Stacy?
It was Stacy, right. That's it, And that's also a big part of Spider-Man, was always protecting his loved ones, as it is any superhero. But that was it. There wasn't... The authoritative figure was Uncle Ben dying. Mm-hmm. And them just struggling with, remember, great responsibility, great power, that sort of blah, 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 again and again and again and again. And just wanting to be the good guy.
Yeah.
And it got... as we talk with the narrative, it got either boring, it got repetitive, or it wasn't strong enough. And this one, it's strong.
Right, exactly. And I think that that's something else is kind of important in this whole idea of kind of Spider-Man trying to figure things out and trying to rise to the occasion and try to be a mature 15-year-old or 18-year-old or adult.
Super genius, too, which is part of it. Because it's a big part of being Spider-Man, right?
Yeah,
Not only is he a kid in New York and a teenager and a hero, he's also
he's the guy who loves going to the science fair,
right? Because he figures out his own stuff, and he's not quite at Tony Stark or Bruce Banner level, but he will be.
Yeah, yeah, and just this idea of him kind of trying to sort that out. But if you're going to take a narrative of trying to, let's say, find your path, and you want to make it consumable in a 2-hour period or in a condensed medium, you need to be able to leverage other pieces to build that. And so, and I mean, they did this with Harry Potter too, right? This isn't revolutionary.
Yeah.
But the idea of creating a mentor figure that gives you a foil to resonate either certain points. So in this case, there's that scene with Tony where he's talking about responsibility, and not responsibility using great responsibility there's great power, or great power there's great responsibility. But the idea that I am responsible for you. You are responsible. I am responsible for the things that you do.
Right.
In Harry Potter, he had Dumbledore, who kind of was constantly looking over his shoulder, and you can kind of look at a lot of the antics that these characters get into,
right,
and think, how are these guys not getting in more trouble?
Right.
Who's running interference
right.
for their screw ups? And in this case, I think they did the best job of kind of demonstrating, well, clearly, here's someone who is. It's not just a matter of oh no, the Daily Bugle hates Peter Parker,
right,
and or hates Spider-Man. You've got a situation where there is somebody who feels like they're enabling him, and that person is going to step in to say, wait a minute, you need to make sure that you're doing things right. That you've got to recognize the consequences. Understand
the consequences, exactly. And as I have accepted to be your guardian, those consequences fall on me as well, and I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did. It's funny you mentioned Harry Potter. Again, we didn't even discuss this afterwards as well to each other. Watching Spider-Man Homecoming, I felt a lot of similarities between Harry Potter and specifically, I believe it's Goblet of Fire, when that first one when Harry turns into a teenager and they have all the dance with the girls coming from other schools, and they've got to ask them to, there's the whole teenage thing again that they did very well on film. And also, again, I felt it too with, it's just something that has happened recently. Again, like you said, it's not like this, they're the first people to do this. Something that has happened recently in movies with kids being heroes. And that, I agree absolutely that this was, Harry Potter did it over 7 movies, and he started much younger, and that's their story, and a great story it is. We're both fans. But this was the same thing with the Guardian looking over, and it's necessary in movies. Mm-hmm. In comic books, in literature and hard literature, right, you can drag that out over a long period of time. You may be reading a 30-page comic book or even a 100-page graphic novel. You don't necessarily need that because that's sort of a one-off story within itself, maybe, or it's part of a longer narrative. In a movie, you've got 2 hours to convey that. Yeah. They did a great job, I think. They skipped the origin story.
Yes.
I loved it. How many times do we have to see it? Even if they did a 10-minute version, I would have been okay with it. But they completely just, look, you all know, you know what happened. The spider bit him, he got the blah, 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 blah. But yeah, fine, it's done. It doesn't, Uncle Ben died. You know that. Uncle Ben, I don't think, as I'm pretty sure, never mentioned.
I don't need to see Thomas and Martha Wayne ever get shot
ever again. Right? I agree. Like, it's the same. We know how it happened. We know that what it caused and the effects that it had. I love that they did, man. I love that Uncle Ben wasn't there and that there wasn't any, what's great responsibility, great power. And there wasn't, maybe there was in the background, we don't know, but I don't think there was even a picture of Uncle Ben up, like, Yeah,
I don't recall anything. The reference, kind of the reference to that was the reference when he's talking to his friend and he says at one point, I can't tell May because on top of everything.
Right.
And there's just this kind of underlying feeling of, she's gone through some stuff and clearly there was, something else there to tie Aunt May. There was more to that home. And
but we know it, right?
But we know it, exactly.
It didn't insult our intelligence. No. It didn't ram it in our face again, like other things that we've said. The director, the writers knew. As the audience, we know that already. We get it. We don't have to understand it. Shit happened in the past. He's protective of her. She's gone through some stuff. Move on. That's all you need to know. It didn't make a difference what it was.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't know it, you got the sense, okay, some bad stuff has happened in her life and he doesn't want to cause any more trauma.
Right.
Great. That's all I need to know. Move on. And they did. And it was fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that was definitely another thing that, partly by placing him as a 15-year-old and not, say, an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old, they took that Daily Bugle bit and they pulled that out too.
Right.
And I actually, it's one of the...
And they took the whole photographer bit out too.
Yeah. And they kind of have a nod to it at the very beginning.
Right.
He's kind of shooting some home movies or something. But and in the 90s animated series, I actually really, really liked the way that they leveraged his photography and his relationship with the Bugle. There was a lot of interplay in a very kind of... It was well worked into the narrative. It didn't feel clunky. It didn't feel heavy-handed. Just things where, he might talk about his camera or worrying about film or selling pictures and what pictures could use and things like that. Whereas, in this case, we didn't really have that. And I think that was smart because it didn't need to be the part of the narrative. Like, you have... That can be something interesting, but I think that in itself you have to hatch with a more developed character who can then take on those things. Which, if you go back to the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man, right, when you're running through that origin story, you're going through it very fast, and this idea of gotta have money is really, really quickly in there. And sure, that's one way to approach it, but I never really felt like that was an applicable thing for. I guess the narrative drive for Spider-Man. It's always something that's there. It looms, but it's more like he likes to be a photographer for the Daily Bugle because he likes photography, not because this is, I guess, the best way for me to make quick cash.
Right. Well, I think in the first one too, that it would have made more sense had they set up the need for money.
Right.
What does a 17-year-old or 18-year-old really need that money for?
Right. The idea that
most people are not at that age are not driven to get as much cash as they can, especially a scientist genius. If perhaps they'd shown, Aunt May was, my pension's out and we don't have any money to pay the rent, if they at least worked that angle a little more.
Well, they did that. They did that in the Sam Raimi ones, but it was...
Well, I don't think it was that strong.
I felt it was actually almost too heavy-handed. But the idea that he was trying to save up for a car before that, this idea that he wants to save up a car so he can press MJ, and then he sees Aunt May's bills.
Right, that's one thing.
But I felt like that whole kind of... The interplay between him and Jameson, the strength of that interplay has always been that he respects Jameson as a mentor,
right?
As a business mentor, as a lot of people respect, that great manager you had at one point when you delivered pizzas, or that whatever.
James might hate Spider-Man, but he knows what sells pictures.
Exactly.
What sells papers.
And he kind of takes a shine to Parker, as much as he has a gruff attitude. There's this idea that he kind of begrudgingly he likes and respects people.
Well, he knows he gets the results too, right?
Exactly. But I felt that, anyways. But that's, we're kind of dwelling on that part.
And I think, sorry to get back just before we leave it, because we're about to leave it. In terms of the cartoon, that's an advanced Spider-Man, as you said.
Yes.
He's much later on in life, and we know who he is by then. And that cartoon, along with, and we're going to talk about this in an upcoming podcast episode, but that cartoon was a fantastic iteration of Spider-Man, along with all the other cartoons that came out at that same time, the X-Men, the Batman, cartoons that were there too. But that is a much more, it's a different medium, right? You're talking about a 22-minute episode for kids specifically, or for a younger audience, not a broad audience. You can do a lot more. You have a lot more leeway and a lot more wiggle room to do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. You don't have to deliver a one great piece. You've got lots of little pieces that some can be better than others, etc. So even if there was a falter here and there, it didn't make a difference from a movie standpoint. J.K. Simmons did a great job because it was a great casting. But I agree. I always questioned that character felt pushed in. Mm-hmm. He was there because everybody expects J. Jonah Jameson to be there. Yeah, he didn't do anything. Didn't need to be there, or they didn't do a good enough job of describing why he's there and that he does drive Spider-Man, that he does, as you said, sort of, I hate him, but I like him, and I know this is what I do for a living, so, that developed that relationship, because how could they in that short of a time, so therefore just drop him. But then again, the Sam Raimi movies definitely had a problem with too many characters, and...
Well, in an attempt, I think that you've got to... And we've seen this in a number of films as well, where they have this desire... Everything that is considered a touch point for superfans, we want to work all of that in, right? So that they'll be elated with everything, and you kind of have to be willing to say, no, let's scale back to what's our core here. Right. And again, in this case, with Homecoming, they scaled back and they really looked at this kind of finite piece of how, okay, we want to introduce Peter and a certain number of high school students. I noticed they're very good about the number of them that they gave names. Right. There were characters that we see a bunch of, but you never know their names.
Because they're not important.
Correct. Exactly. And that's how you know.
The whole team for the decathlon, right? Other than the three people that were already introduced. Exactly. And some of them had a couple of lines.
Exactly.
They were comedic lines.
They were a point of comic relief. They were a point of involvement, but you didn't feel like, I know who that guy is or whatever. And I think that was important. I think something else that we've discussed before, and I think is additionally important to superhero narratives as a whole, but also the Spider-Man narrative, is the villain. I know we've had some discussions in the past. We have a bit of a differing opinion on the strength of Spider-Man's rogue gallery. Correct. But I think one of the things that Spider-Man has is his villains aren't necessarily direct foils. So you look at Venom and Carnage as the symbiotes are supposed to exist as kind of that holding up of the mirror. Here's a twisted version of Spider-Man. Here's a version of Spider-Man that is, what if he went rogue? What if he broke?
I don't know if I'd even classify them as, they are rogues, but they're a unique rogue. And for that reason.
Yes, exactly. But other than that, I feel like the rest of his villains, this is one of the reasons I also like The Flash as much as I do, is I feel both Spider-Man's villains and The Flash's villains, a lot of them are essentially just souped up bank robbers. You look at guys like the Shocker, Mysterio.
I completely agree.
Captain Cold, Heatwave, all these guys. These are all guys who they're not out for world domination. They're out because maybe they've got some pride hooked up into what they do. But these are guys, if they could just knock over a bank and could take home a big chunk of change, they'd be happy for a long time. And again, going back to that 90s cartoon, they had kind of the idea of the Shocker as a mercenary villain. He's not an A-tier rogues gallery, but he's a fan favorite. And to introduce him as somebody who's kind of a mercenary was really good. I think that the villain motivation in this one of the Vulture and the in exchange his Shocker, kind of henchmen and the other villains that he kind of brings together, all those guys are really they are motivated ultimately by this greed, and it's not.
Shocker is arguably still a mercenary in this one. He's just working for the Vulture.
Absolutely, and I think that's immensely important as something that you can see. There's a sequence towards the end with the Vulture, and spoiler alert, you can skip ahead a minute and a half if you want to. But he's about to be destroyed. Spider-Man saves his life and rescues him. And that sequence, when that was happening, I noted that it was very clear that what they were telegraphing to us was Spider-Man's going to do the right thing because that's what he wants to do above all else. And the Vulture is going to do the wrong thing. And if he does die, it is a consequence of him giving in to his greed.
Right.
And that's all there is to it.
So I have long since loathed the Spider-Man Rogues Gallery in movies.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. I think his Rogues Gallery, for the most part, yes, of course, there are exceptions to the rule. And I'm sure I'm going to be lambasted for this in the comments, hopefully, because that means you're all listening, and that's great. But for the most part, they're one-dimensional bank robbers, like you said. I mean, and they're not just that; they're guys that have a one-dimensional power, so to speak. My favorite example is Mysterio, who is a special effects guy who was also always just a bank robber. But if you get through the effects, the guy doesn't have any strength or agility, and you take off the fishbowl and punch him in the face. That's it. He's gone. It's very easy to dispatch him. And all the other guys have their own gimmick, whether you're a Scorpion or Shocker or Rhino or whatever. And I think that in the cartoon, that's great. It holds up great for a 22-minute cartoon or even a double episode. Absolutely, there's nothing wrong with that. But in a movie, those characters are very thin and very weak, and they don't have a lot of dimension that you can develop because there's not much to them. There's only so much you can go before you're developing nothing because there's nothing to draw on. This movie did a very good job of correcting that in Homecoming. Yeah. He did have something to draw on. Like you said, it was great, and they did a great job of showing in the beginning that he was a family man. He was just trying to make a living like anybody else, and that's taken away from him.
Yeah.
No, that can drive anybody, and that's great. And then they do a great job of developing that throughout the movie. Using the example you just did at the end when he sort of, Spider-Man redeems himself, well, not salvation, so to speak, and saves him even though he is the enemy. And the enemy, the bad guy does what the bad guy does, was perfect. Comparatively, let's use Spider-Man 2 from Raimi with Doc Ock, a movie which I thought was meh. And I mean that in its truest sense because I didn't feel Doc Ock was evil enough. Yeah, of course they do some scenes and he's, whatever, he does some things to people. And there's that great scene on the subway, sure, when he's going to kill a bunch of innocent people, so to speak, because he's mad. But here you're talking about a guy who lost his wife, and he's mad at that. And because of that, he sort of goes nuts for a little bit. And then at the end of the movie, Doc Ock kind of has his own salvation. And as everything's sinking around him, he decides to sacrifice himself and Spider-Man and save everybody else. That's not... He wasn't mean enough to deserve that salvation. And he wasn't mean enough for me to care about that. And it just seemed out of character. Doc Ock is one of the few characters in Spider-Man's gallery who I do think has depth to it, and they took it away. Mm-hmm. And I don't care if that guy's good or I didn't care about him as a good guy or a bad guy, and then he just switches around. They almost made it seem like his arms were the bad guys, and they were just controlling him, which is not really the way it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. This one, Homecoming, he was a bad guy who then got a hold of technology that enhanced his evilness, so to speak, that he could use as a tool to spread it around. And that's the way it needs to be. There was character development. Again, the other movies, the second Garfield installation with Shocker. Again, Shocker, he's a one-dimensional guy.
You mean Electro?
Electro. Sorry, yes. Jamie Foxx. Again, one-dimensional guy, and they did a good job with the special effects, so it looked cool. Mm-hmm. But again, he's just a guy down on his luck who has one power. Yeah, it might be a little devastating power, but there's no sense of true evilness to him to be a really rogue villain and to really hate him and to really hate Spider-Man that much and to do all the badness. I'm not saying every villain has to want to take over the world, but they need some reason and they need some depth to them. Going the complete opposite way, of course, to Dark Knight, for instance. That's as much a movie about the Joker as it is Batman, right? And yes, Heath Ledger's performance and that writing is fantastic. And that movie itself, that didn't need to be a superhero movie. That was just a great piece of cinema. But one of the reasons that movie is so good is because of how evil and how because of the Joker and what they want you to think of him, whether he's chaotic, whether he is cunning. you don't know that. You just know that's one bad mofo, and he does stuff for no reason, but it's always bad stuff. That's who he is. Mm-hmm. And they develop that throughout the whole movie. And you see it beautifully, both in the performance and the writing. So it makes a good movie.
Well, and both that movie and Spider-Man Homecoming open with villains.
Right.
You don't open with a focus on, here's our hero. Here's our hero who's making his bones, who's getting his powers, or whatever it might be. It opens up and it says, here is someone who is either... In Spider-Man Homecoming, here's a guy who's trying to make a living.
Here's why the conflict's coming.
Yeah, and who breaks effectively. And in Dark Knight, you have a situation of here's a guy who's already broken, and
here's how broken he is. Look at it.
Yes,
but again, that's a brilliant scene because he's just robbing a bank.
Yeah,
but of course, you figure out he's robbing a specific bank for a specific reason.
Yeah,
and he kills the whole crew. Yeah, right. He kills whoever he doesn't need. They're gone anyways. In ruthless killing. I mean, that one when he shoots that one guy, I forget what the line is, when he says, something to him and he doesn't even look at him when he shoots him.
Yeah.
Right? You just get into how crazy he is, and yet there is an absolute method to his madness.
Yeah.
So yes, they set it up, and yeah, this one too, as you said, just brilliant. That this is the guy. Here's why he broke.
Mm-hmm.
You already know about the superhero. We don't need to show you that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think to me one of the advantages of villains like Electro, Sandman. A lot of these, what I consider kind of typical, kind of early supervillains, the period of comic proliferation where they just need to keep their villain of the week. You had to have a villain of the week.
Yeah. And
they all had a different flavor. And I mean, DC had the Crazy Quilt and Calendar Man and stuff like that too, right?
There's way more one-dimensional, crappy villains, so to speak, than good ones.
Yeah, but what I kind of liked about the Spider-Man ones is that his way of overcoming them, which was really, again, well telegraphed in the 90s cartoon, which I would highly recommend. If anyone hasn't watched it, at least right now it's on Netflix, totally worth checking out, because it shows him outthinking them. The catch with Electro isn't, I've got to be strong. It's not, when I did collect comics, the guy I talked to at the store, he would recommend things to me, and often he would say, this doesn't fall into the Dragon Ball Z problem.
Right.
And the Dragon Ball Z problem is, I have to fight harder, I have to punch harder, right. I have to fight longer, I have to be stronger. That's right. It. It was, look, I have to outsmart him. I have to, if I'm dealing with Electro, how can I use my webbing to create an insulated tool, right. or trap him in a capacitor so he can't get out? Or Sandman, I'm going to use a shot vac to vacuum up so much of him that he can't keep himself going, or things like that. So I like that idea. And they have kind of some moments of that in Spider-Man Homecoming.
He's also just starting.
Yeah, but they leverage that. They said, right. Here's a situation that you've seen Spider-Man do in other movies, in other medium, where he's going to use all his web to hold something together, and then it's not working out.
Right.
And this idea that he's still kind of moving in that direction, but he's not quite there. And I like that. I think that that's something that often you don't get with characters. You get them kind of fully baked because they're superhero.
Well, that's also, I think, back to what we were discussing before. That's because Spider-Man's intelligence is part of his character. Mm-hmm. That is part of his hero.
Yes.
That's part of what makes him a superhero. It's not, as Homecoming does its main point of explaining, or Spider-Man's voyage, so to speak, his character voyage, the suit doesn't make the hero.
Right.
Again, foiling those villains with or without intelligence in a comic book or in a cartoon are fine. In a movie, it becomes much more of a challenge, I think. So, Simon was in Spider-Man 3, mm-hmm. but again, he wasn't, again, his motivation was daughter,
yeah.
right? And again, he was a bad guy trying to doing bad things protect his family. But again, once that's done, once that's resolved, he shouldn't be a bad guy anymore.
Right.
And then they also don't do a good job of using Spider-Man's intelligence to solve that problem.
Right.
Spider-Man 3 had problems from just the start to the finish. Everything else was, the credits were fine.
You've heard that Raimi has apologized for
yes.
it.
Yeah. I know.
Right,
as well he should.
Yeah.
As well he should.
Well, but
my point was that vehicle then with the enemies doesn't work in the movies unless those guys are secondary characters.
Mm-hmm.
You need to show Spider-Man's intelligence.
Right.
And it's not really doable with an Electro who, in the whole movie, how many times can you foil him by creating insulation? How many times can you use the lithium crystals, Kirk, until we know what's going to happen? It's that same thing. It's just over and over again. So again, for comics, for cartoons, it's fine. For a movie, it's very, very different. And that's, to me, as we discussed coming out of every Spider-Man movie, it was the villain. That was the problem. It wasn't enough to drive the movie. And when that's a big cog in that machine, and when it fails, the whole movie has a catastrophic fail.
Yeah.
And this one did not have that, and that's why I think it was, for many reasons, but that thing is one of the main reasons why they did a good job of explaining the Spider-Man narrative, and that was properly supported by a great villain. And by the way, thank God Michael Keaton has decided to come back into acting, or whatever his personal reasons for. I'm very glad that you're back, because since he's come back, just like before he left, they're just all great performances.
Yeah.
And so thankful for that. He was great in this.
Yeah, he was fantastic.
The whole movie was very well casted, actually.
Yeah. And I would say that even in the past,
I agree.
Whatever problems I've had with the movies, I think the castings have been great.
Yeah.
This is just a complete side note, but I want to give a nod. Diversity in this movie was clearly important.
Absolutely. And I did not see the MJ twist coming.
No.
That was done well. That's all we'll say about that.
Yeah, but it was very good.
Whoa, I remember looking around the theater, and there was a bunch of people who was like, "Oh wow, that I did not see that." So
that was well done. But one thing also that this movie does that I think is kind of the crux to, going forward in the world in which we exist, from the big Marvel timeline and the new DCU movies and new Justice League coming out and I don't know, the umpteenth reboots that are going to happen in comics and probably cartoons and everything else we'll see. But one thing that I have to say that this movie does well, Spider-Man Homecoming, and other things like the Jessica Jones TV series on Netflix was good for as well, is that it's a universe that works well within its concessions. And to clarify that, because I know I've described this to you before, but in Spider-Man Homecoming, I have suspended my disbelief that a 15-year-old kid can be bit by 14-year-old kid can be bit by a radioactive spider and gain superpowers, and that he can be so smart that he has developed his own web fluid.
Right.
I have accepted that. That is a world that I'm willing to buy into.
Correct.
Now, in Iron Man 3, I have bought into the world that there is a guy, Tony Stark, who's smart enough to make these suits, that he has this repulsor technology that can essentially make anything fly on a tiny jet of air.
Right.
And I've bought into that world.
Right.
When Tony Stark
happy to do so.
Has there's going to be some spoilers here for Iron Man 3. It's an older movie.
Get over it.
Yeah.
You should have seen it already. If you're listening to this podcast, you should have seen it already.
Exactly. If you're that invested, I would think that you've seen it by now.
Correct.
And there are some great parts in that film too, but there's a part coming towards the end, leading into the third act, which is notoriously tricky for superhero films.
Right.
Where he has a suit, the suit he has that he's been using all film gets hit by a truck. And he doesn't have it anymore. And he turns to Rhodey, and Rhodey says, "The suit's gone?" And he says, "Yeah, that's all I got." That's not all he got.
He's got so much more.
We've bought into this universe. We've also bought into this. This is a place where literally he can call Captain America. He can call Hawkeye. He can call anybody in S.H.I.E.L.D., really. He has an international espionage agency at his fingertips. Okay, let's say...
Or his own technology that is limitless.
Exactly.
He's got a supercomputer that can run the world, for Christ's sake, at his disposal.
Right.
That he created.
And you've got, there's so many other things that we've kind of bought into. Like, throw up the Tony signal, somebody's going to respond. As opposed to... you look at Spider-Man Homecoming, and while we've bought into this kind of this medium, we never have a situation where all of a sudden he has to. A good example. There's a driving sequence, and he's driving, and he's driving very poorly, as we would expect a 15-year-old. But he says, I've only ever driven in a few parking lots with May, and this is really different. And you can see, okay, so we have an understanding of why he has that skill level. It's a realistic reason that he has that level of skill. And at the same time, we can kind of suspend our... Yeah, sure, that level of skill would be... let's say it's enough to get him where he needs to be.
I agree, and this is sort of straying off topic, and maybe we'll do another discussion about it at a later point. But I think specifically in sort of superhero and action movies, one of the biggest problems is when those movies go beyond our suspension of disbelief, right? Yeah. So yes, of course there's a baseline set that we as the viewer are willing to accept, whether it's Transformers or Batman or Spider-Man or Iron Man, whatever it is, we get that certain things are obviously not normal to this world and they're going to be normal in the world we're watching. Fantastic. But when it starts to insult our intelligence, or when it starts to defy the laws of physics to a point that's just absurd, or defy the laws of normal occurrences, in Homecoming, just because it's fresh for what we're talking about, there's only one scene where I was really like, really? And that there's a fight going on outside of school, and school buses, which are in the school parking lot, are being destroyed as people are inside at a school dance. Now, it's a school dance, so there's music playing, I get that. But you're really telling me that as two guys go smashing through buses and they get flown, this is a school bus, it's a large vehicle, nobody hears that, nobody comes outside, Right. Those instances, when they happen in movies, they're very stupid. Yeah. That's what they are. And sometimes, and using your example as a great example, sometimes all you need is just one little line of dialogue or one little edit to explain it to the audience. As you said, he's driving, he's not that good. Why wouldn't Spider-Man be good? Why, or what's going on? How could...
Well, boom. He's got such great reflexes.
Right, boom. I've only been driving a couple of times in the parking lot with May. Got it.
Yeah.
That's it. Done. Check. We're cool.
Yeah.
That's fine. I don't have any other problems with that. And there's so many specifically superhero movies that are lacking in those moments when they're not good, and when they're not explained, and you sit there and go, did nobody in editing really, just a couple of edits, you could have made this so much better.
Yeah.
And it's exasperating as a viewer sometimes, and feel, as I said, it literally feels like you're insulting my intelligence, because you're either sometimes they throw it in your face, or sometimes you're just like, come on. So the perfect example of that is the Transformer movies, right, which we were so excited to see them. We're the Transformer generation. You and I, we grew up with the toys. We still have all our Transformer toys, and very proud of that.
Absolutely.
We went to see that first movie. We were like giddy kids, and we saw the movie, and there were parts in that movie, right, when the big robots, then they jump and transform, and then one fell motion just jump, transform, roll out, and the effects were just great. It was a manifestation of childhood fantasies, and we loved it. And then the rest of the movie happened, and it was just god-awful. And, I remember standing outside the theater discussing that movie, and you and I were almost laughing at it. And then we saw 2, and we laughed the whole way through. It was so bad. And I don't think you and I even saw 3 and 4, and nobody saw 5, because they're just so beyond stupid.
Yeah. And to kind of just bring it back again to Spider-Man Homecoming, we have here an example of a movie that really works with its own concessions and doesn't really push outside of that, and works well, and that goes back to good writing, and good direction and composition, and
in the medium it got the narrative right for a movie.
Yeah,
finally.
Exactly. And I think something else that I just want to kind of take a second to kind of give a shout out to was the diversity in this movie. It was very well represented, and I think they definitely took some spins on certain characters that you wouldn't necessarily expect from the comics. As people will have been saying for a long time, that doesn't negatively impact characters.
Absolutely not.
It just changes. It makes the tapestry of your vision more representative, and if you're more realistic.
If you're going apeshit because a character who was blonde in a cartoon isn't blonde on movies, you got other problems.
Yeah.
You're just a troll.
Absolutely. Also, just, as we're talking about movies, we wanted to talk about Spider-Man in particular because we just saw Homecoming, and we've seen the other 5 films more recently, and we're familiar with kind of a bunch of the other mediums of it, but I think another film which deserves a bit of a shout out, kind of a quick nod, really could be its own podcast, but the Wonder Woman film we've both seen was an excellent film, was another excellent superhero film, was well put together. Again, we're talking great composition, great cinema, great story, great everything. A great approach that was feminist. We would both, I believe, identify ourselves as feminists, and you had a character who they did the fish out of water approach, but she wasn't naive, she wasn't childish, she didn't seem like she was anything less than anyone else.
She was never meek or acquiesced to a man at any point, or strayed from her character.
Yeah, exactly.
She was Wonder Woman.
She was a strong character brought from a different perspective, brought into these situations. Who
happened to be female.
Exactly.
And happened to be the better warrior than everybody else for numerous reasons.
Absolutely.
And therefore took charge. I agree, it was fantastic, and it was a well-needed, finally, a woman as the lead, and a strong lead.
Yeah.
And as we were discussing, it was great to see. I was excited seeing a strong character like that for women, and I'm a guy, so I can only imagine how some women felt, and some people with young daughters. I know we have friends. One of them has mentioned to me how one of her nieces, she wants to play with action figures, but there are no women action figures.
Right.
And now they've got one. Now all the toys are out, and I think that's just fantastic.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
It's a great piece of cinema. You should go see it anyways. And from a female empowerment standpoint, it's long overdue, and we absolutely applaud it on all fronts.
Right.
But great narrative. Talk what we were discussing today.
Yeah.
Great narrative, and great narrative for a movie, and a great character narrative for that translated to the movie properly. I mean,
absolutely.
She was Wonder Woman from start to finish. They never strayed from that.
But she still had an arc.
Correct.
Was still
they still developed her.
She interacted with the other characters.
Absolutely.
The other characters brought something to her story, and she brought something to theirs. But it didn't feel clumsy. It didn't feel forced or anything like that. And I think that was very important. It also, like we talked about, working within its concessions. If you accept kind of her and her nature and everything else, you kind of buy into these other moments that you have in the film.
Right.
And I'm just gonna say the lasso of truth as a device seems kind of silly in a lot of ways, and then when you see people kind of using it in an innovative fashion, or just even in a way that kind of takes it seriously without being dour, it's really refreshing.
Right.
And that was really great. So that kind of thing, at least for me, I've always found the idea that she has bracers that can deflect bullets, I was kind of like, okay, I'm always being on board with that.
Sure.
But the idea of the lasso of truth and how people succumb to it, and how it can compel others, it was really just, I think that was well executed. And it didn't seem cartoonish, but they did have a good mix of kind of comedic relief.
Right, which you needed, especially in a superhero movie.
Absolutely.
And comics have a lot of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Little tongue-in-cheek.
Chris Pine was great in that. He was very well casted again. Yeah.
So I think that is definitely something we just wanted to mention, and like I say, it could have been its own podcast. It just didn't happen to be what got our attention this week. Or today, and so today we wanted to talk about Spider-Man, and I think we've done that. So
I think so.
If you think that you've got something to add to the conversation, please definitely reach out to us on Twitter and Instagram at Get Our Attention.
You can always email us at info@thegoatshow.ca.
So for this week, I've been Joe,
and I'm still Josh.